23, it's kind of an interesting story. There's a bunch of, haggling about money. There's a little bit of demurring, and the word demur means to be kind of humble and reticent, to kind of back away from things. Both of the people who are trying to either buy or sell the land are trying to show the utmost humility and respect. They do it the way that Asians would do something, and they still do it until this day. If you go to Japan and China, if you're trying to purchase a car, they're not like Americans. We're right out front, and the sign says you want $100, I'll give you 50, and then you haggle. They won't do it that way. They do it a little bit differently. But beyond that, you might read it and say, I have no idea why this chapter is here in the Bible. And I'm hoping to encourage you this morning to see that this is a really important chapter. I mean, they're all important, and preachers are always known for that, saying this is the most important thing I've seen, in the Bible. Genesis 23 will be exactly that. Abraham purchases a grave. Verse 1 says, Sarah lived 127 years, and these were the years of the life of Sarah. So because Isaac was born when Sarah was 90, Isaac is 37 years old. So this is about 3 years before Isaac is going to be married, I believe. And so Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham stood up before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth. And the word Heth is where we get the concept Hittites. You're familiar with the Hittites who lived in the land. Same word, just different vowel pointing. So he spoke to the Hittites. I am a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Now when he says give, the word that's used for give often refers to that which is purchased or sold or bought. So he's not asking for it for free. He's just saying make it available so that I can purchase it. Verse 5 says, And the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying unto him, Hear us now, my Lord. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. In other words, we got cemeteries. We've got lots of them. She can be laid in any cemetery that you want. None of us will withhold from you his burial place, that you may bury your dead. And then Abraham, and by the way, does that ring a bell with you? Is she going to be buried in a pagan cemetery? Of course, the answer is not on your life, and the reasons will be important later. And then Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, the sons of Heth, and he spoke with them, saying, If it is your wish that I bury my dead out of my sight, hear me. Out of my sight, hear me, and meet with Ephron, the son of Zophar, for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he has, which is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me at a full price as property for a burial place among you. So this isn't just for Sarah. This will be for the family, a family burial plot. Now Ephron dwelt among the sons of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the presence of the sons of Heth and all who entered at the gate of his city, saying, Now you know what it means when you meet at the gate of a city. Who did we see in the past who met at the gate of a city? That would have been Lot when he was there dealing with the people in Sodom and Gomorrah. To sit in the gate of a city meant to be the judge, to be the person in authority. And so that's what we're doing again. This is a legal proceeding at the end of verse 10. Verse 11, No, my Lord, but hear me. I give you the field and the cave that is in it, and I give it to you in the presence of the sons of my people. In other words, legally, I give it to you, bury your dead. And then Abraham bowed himself down before the people of the land, and he spoke with Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, If you will give it to me, then please hear me. I will give you money for the field. Take it from me, and I will bury my dead there. So Ephron answered Abraham and said unto him, My Lord, listen to me. Pardon me, I'm going to move my microphone. It's in the wrong place. So I'm looking down. 14, Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, My Lord, listen to me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? So bury your dead. In other words, you're rich and I'm rich, and we don't really need to haggle with money. Money is not an issue, nor should it be a reason for us to contend. Verse 16, and then Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out the silver for Ephron that he had named in the hearing of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, currency of the merchants. And so the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave which was in it, and all of the trees that were in the field, in other words, don't be stealing my lumber, things like that, which were within the surrounding borders, were deeded to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the sons of Heth before all those who went to the gate of his city. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And so the field and the cave that is in it were deeded to Abraham, but the sons of Heth as property for a burial place, of course, for his wife and for his family. As I look at this passage, there are multiple things that we could discuss, and we will discuss probably this week and next week as we work on it together. I think we want to take 2 weeks and go through the issue. The first thing that we notice, and you ought to consider, is Abraham finally owns some property. All of these years he's been living there since when he was 75. He didn't own any land. He was told to be by the Lord a pilgrim and a sojourner. And finally he owns some land, but only in the death of his wife. And so frankly, Abraham continues to be a pilgrim, but Sarah is a pilgrim no longer. And that's really worth thinking about right at the gate here this morning, which is we're called to be sojourners and pilgrims. First Peter talks about that concept, and we don't live in this world. This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. That was true for Abraham and Sarah also. We're told in the book of Hebrews chapter 11 that Abraham looked for a city whose builder and maker is God, and so he really knew that this wasn't the place. And so he never owned any land whatsoever, but Sarah is dead. And now that she's dead, she's no longer a pilgrim. And that's exactly true for us, that the day will come in our lives in which we pass on, or when we are laying our beloved ones in the grave, and at that moment, their journey is done, their travel is over, and they are with the Lord. It is my belief, not everyone believes exactly this, so I'll give you the two main options that are biblical options. Some people believe that Old Testament saints do not go to heaven until after Christ went to heaven himself when he raised from the dead. That's a good and a reasonable understanding of the passage. There are a couple of verses that make people lean in that direction. The other godly understanding, biblical understanding, is that everybody from the time of Adam until the end of time who is a believer, genuine believers in the Lord, entered exactly into the presence of the Lord. Maybe you haven't heard that very often, and I don't really want to make that a major discussion today, but happy to talk about that at some point. I simply believe that Old Testament saints were saved the way that we're saved. They're born again when the Holy Spirit would enter them in not the same way we have the Spirit, but to a degree. They're born again, and to be absent from the body, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, is to be present with the Lord. So that's why I think, and I think there are many passages that talk about the Old Testament saints going right into the presence of the Lord as soon as they die. Psalm 73, whom have I in heaven and you but you? You hold me with your hand. There's another statement that he says there, and then after I die, you receive me into glory. Psalm 73, I think 23 or 24. Haven't read it for a time, but that seems to be the picture that Old Testament saints, as you look at how they lived and died, that they entered into the presence of Jesus at the point of death. A couple of examples. Where did Moses go? Just think about it. The Lord buried Moses up on Mount Nebo, I think it was, and he received him there. He laid down and died. I believe his presence went there. When Enoch was taken, Enoch in Genesis chapter 5 didn't die. Where did he go? Well, the text says he went to heaven. I mean, that's not even really disputable. So if Enoch went to heaven when he walked with the Lord, when the Lord raptured him, and by the way, the word for rapture is used there in the book of Genesis. The Lord took him. It means rapture in the very same way that we use the term rapture. If Enoch went to heaven when he died, then why can't everybody else go? And another example, when you see Elijah, what happened to Elijah? You read the text, and I should not break into song. It's hard not to break into song, isn't it? You know, he'll be caught up in a chariot of fire. That's the song that I'm really resisting singing this morning. Elijah, as the chariot came and separated between Elisha and Elijah, and so drove them apart, and Elijah got on that fiery chariot, it would make no sense to assume that he went up in the clouds and then the Lord took him back down to the center of the earth. I believe Elijah went into the presence of the Lord, especially when you read the conversations between the sons of the prophets and Elisha. The Lord's going to take your master today. You know, this is his departing day. Yeah, I know, be quiet. You know, we've got this thing. Leave us alone. So anyways, with all of those examples, I believe that Sarah is in the presence of the Lord at this moment in Genesis chapter 23. And so Abraham comes to mourn. And it is a beautiful picture of what it means to mourn. And if you will allow me to handle this passage this way, I want to talk next week about grief and mourning a little bit more than I am this week. So this week, some staging things, some information, and next week we'll deal with the importance of grieving. Because grieving is good. Grieving is godly. Grieving is expected. But to be to the point of losing your mind or frantic, that's not something that we do as God's people. And clearly, Abraham, when he's coming here to grieve, he's doing a fine job. And wouldn't you just like to be a mouse, you know, or some other animal, and just hear the grieving, the comments that Abraham is making to his family, to Isaac who was there, and to the locals as he talks about his wife. No doubt they had many things that they would say. And so with that in mind, Abraham buys a plot of land, and Sarah, and frankly Abraham to some degree, are pilgrims no longer. Let's talk about the land for a while. This plot of land that we're looking at here is the second most sacred piece of land for Jewish people today. I've been to Israel twice over the years, 86 and then 2019 I think it was, or something like that. And we never got to go to Hebron. Hebron is in the West Bank, and it's always a contested piece of ground, if you can understand. But within the sanctuary area where the grave of Abraham is, there is both a mosque and a synagogue. So the Jews Jewish nation, they control it. They police it, if you will. And so they've made sure that people of both faith traditions can come in and say their prayers and show respect. But this is a wonderful place for the nation of Israel. Why would it be, other than the Temple Mount itself, why would this place be the place of the greatest sacred devotion for Israelis? Well, because of the fact that Father Abraham is buried there, and Sarah is buried there, and other children are buried there. And believe it or not, the Jews, the Talmud and some of their writings claim that Adam and Eve were buried there. Probably not, you know, but they claim it. They claim that Adam and Eve were also buried there. It doesn't, you know, you think through, well, how did they get through the flood, you know, and things like that. But they like to claim things, and that was one of the things that they claimed along the way. If you were to go there today and look at this cave, we know that the cave is there, and that there are grave sites within the cave. One person in the 1100s was able to go down into the caves. And let me see if I can't find the detail. A historian in the 12th century, 1100s, recorded passing through an iron gate and walking through a first cave, and then into a second cave, and then finally into a third cave. So cave after cave after cave, which would make sense. And I hope that it's kind of opens your understanding. Don't just think of it as like a 6-foot hole on the ground. This would be a major cave. Like if you go down, into Kansas and Missouri, there are caves down there that you can go way back into. Anyways, so he entered the cave, but in the third cave, he came upon 6 graves. And the 6 graves were the graves of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rebekah and Leah. Now, Rachel isn't buried there. I believe that would be the case. And as he passed each of the 6 graves, this was the inscription that he read. This is the grave of, and then it said Abraham, this is the grave of Isaac, this is the grave of Sarah, this is the grave of Rebekah, and then this is the grave of, who would be left? Leah would be the next one. And so after that, what's interesting is this land became so significant to the people that they often fought over it. The cave here in Machpelah, or in Hebron, was controlled by the Jews, and then it was controlled by Herod, and then it was controlled by the Christians, and they built churches there, and then it was controlled by the mosques. I don't even know who they are. It was controlled by the Crusaders, and then the Muslim invaders, and then Saladin, who was a Muslim conqueror, then by modern Israel, and then finally it is now controlled by the Jews at this time. If you go to the place and see what's there, you're going to notice that it looks like a church, it looks like a basilica, it looks like a mosque, because they tended to build all of those together. Anybody remember who Moshe Dayan is, by the way? Somebody might have. He was a great general. He fought in the 6-Day War. There's an interesting story about Moshe Dayan, that after they conquered and controlled this land, after not having it for 1,000 years, that as the general, Moshe Dayan decided that he was going to investigate the cave area, looking for Father Abraham. And at that point, he lowered a young woman, 12-year-old woman, down in. She was willing to go. And they took a camera down there and took many pictures of the region. But the one thing that was missing at that time was the bones of Father Abraham. And that's probably likely. What would you expect to find? Bones or no bones in this cave? And since it was controlled by Muslims for many, many years, what do they like to do? They like to tear down things that give any proof of anyone, being of the Jewish faith, being there today. And so let's go ahead and because we've seen it, next week I'm going to give you some pictures. I realized a little bit too late this morning, there's many pictures. I might as well show you what we're talking about here in the book of Genesis. Here are some of the lessons that we look at in this context. And the first lesson is simply the fact that it's not morbid, it's not wrong to express your grief, and that is exactly what we ought to do. And so we ought to prepare for that day, I believe. I don't know if you've thought much about preparing for the day of your death, but I think it's biblical and godly to do that. Listen to what Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 1 and 2 says. He says, and this is Solomon giving wisdom to the young people of the kingdom, "A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death is better than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart." You want to have some wisdom? Then think about the day that you're going to die and anticipate what will the world be like after you? What will people think of you along the way? And it's all connected together, everything he said there, that you ought to have a good reputation. You ought to leave behind, respect from other people. And he says it's better to go to, I don't know if you noticed that, the house of mourning than the house of feasting. Those are terms for what? House of mourning would be a funeral, and a house of feasting would be a wedding. Better to go to a funeral than to a wedding. I can tell you from a minister's perspective, it's entirely easier to do a funeral than it is to do a wedding. Because weddings always go wrong, there's always mistakes, and there's always a lot of different opinions about how everything ought to be run. Everyone wants it to be romantic and everything. But when you go to a funeral, it's like the mask is pulled off and people are listening. And you meet people in a way that you don't meet them in any other situation. So you can speak to them the truth, and you can bare your heart and whatnot. And so that's what he says. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, because that is the end of all men. So better to go to a funeral than to a wedding. I've been struck by the number of people that I've met over the years who have never gone to a funeral. Hard to imagine, but there are people like that who simply don't go to funerals. And when we have funerals here, or even when we attend funerals over in the other facilities in town, it's striking how many people will come to the visitation and then get up and leave and don't stay for the service itself. What they're doing is they're losing great wisdom along the way. And so secondly, not only is it a better place to be, and is Abraham doing a good thing, Abraham is not being morbid by burying his wife, and I just would want you to think about the faithfulness that they enjoyed together for all of those years. Ups and downs, and Abraham twice, what did he do for his wife? He abandoned her twice sold her out, trying to save his own neck, and apparently it didn't bother her too bad, or that she was able to get over it. And the way that I would say she should have handled it is, you owe me big time, you know. But that would have been the case, and thankfully they made it to the end. And I would just encourage you in this regard. Make sure you make it all the way to the grave with your spouse, in whatever way it is, because, you know, when we say our vows, in richer and poor, in sickness and health, till death us do part. That's important for us to continue to live to that very end, and that's what Abraham did here at this time. We could say this, by the way, that there is tremendous wisdom, frankly, in observing how Abraham deals with his dead, and the New Testament tells us that that is exactly what we ought to do. Let me talk for just a second. No, I won't talk about that. We'll leave that later for next week, talking about the difference between grief and despair. Abraham certainly is grievous, but he's not despairing. So a few lessons that we could say here about what's going on. What Abraham is doing here is certainly an act of loving tenderness as he comes to weep and to mourn. Ecclesiastes 7:3 says, sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. And so that would be another thing that we could talk about and think about. And the place that they come, I'm kind of editing out a couple of things I'm going to save until next week. C.S. Lewis had some tremendous things to say about grieving. You might be familiar with C.S. Lewis. I'll give you the story a little bit. He was a single man until his 50s. And then in his 50s, he married a woman whose name was Joy. And as he married Joy, she lived about 3 years, and then she died. And so he wrote a book called Surprised by Joy. And of course, it's a double entendre. His wife's name was Joy. And he walks through what it's like to go through grieving as he thinks, you know, about his wife and what happened. And so we'll save that for next week, because I think it's really insightful. There are a number of books, by the way, from ministers who have gone through grief and have written down their thoughts. Richard Baxter, Richard Baxter is an old Puritan, and if you know anything about the Puritans, they're way too wordy. That if they want to write one sentence, it'll have about 3 paragraphs. The title to the typical Puritan book is about a paragraph long. So everything is words. That's what they do. And he wrote a book about the grief he went through after his wife had passed. And Richard Baxter's book basically just talks about what he feels like every day and how he relates it to Christ, things like that. It's absolutely a tremendous book to understand. What I want to do, though, is I want to talk about Hebron for 6-7 minutes, and then we'll be done for this morning, talking about the location. The location of where Abraham is going to bury his wife is in Hebron. Now, there are several towns in Israel that have real significance in relationship to their name. And I'm going to have to remind you, because, you know, we talked about it, but it won't come to your mind. We said that Shechem was really a significant place. Shechem in the Old Testament is the place of commitment and decision. When the children of Israel came into the land, they came directly to Shechem. Shechem was right in the middle of the land, divided between north and south, and that's where they went out, up on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, and they made their blessings and their curses. 6 of the tribes said, blessed be this, and the other 6 said, cursed be this. And so whenever they needed to do something of a decision or commitment, they went to Shechem. Bethel, as you're familiar, is the place of worship. And so just as Jacob, when he saw the ladder ascending and descending to heaven, and Jesus or the Lord walking on it, that became the house of God, or the gate of God. That was the place of worship. But Hebron is known in the Bible as the place of waiting. Hebron is the place of waiting, and it was the place where Abraham has come to wait. But more than that, it's a place where Sarah has come to wait for her resurrection. And so that's why she's going to be placed in a grave in Hebron, because that's what she's doing. You know, it says about Abraham, Hebrews 11:10, for he waited for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Let's talk about the negotiations. That's what I want to finish for this morning. The negotiations are really, really interesting when they come to negotiate what's going on here. as they're discussing what the price ought to be, Abraham, he talks to Ephron, and he tells Ephron, I'm going to give you the right price, and the significance of it is really significant. He paid 400 shekels for the land. 6 to 8 shekels was typically a yearly wage. And so if you consider 400 and compare that with 6 to 8 shekels, it was a truly, truly significant. A couple of numbers here. The average field at the time of Abraham cost 4 shekels. So Abraham is paying 100 times more for this land than the average field was. A garden land, so, field and garden together, typically costs about 40 shekels. And remember when David was being judged by the Lord, and he looked up and the angel of the Lord was smoting the city of Jerusalem, and David was told to go buy the field or go buy the land, and he bought Araunah's threshing floor. And Araunah's threshing floor became the site of the temple. So big enough for a temple to be there. Guess how much he paid for all of the Temple Mount? He paid 50 shekels for the Temple Mount. It's striking. The last example that I'll give you, Jeremiah. At the end of Jeremiah's ministry, Jeremiah was going to be carried away to Egypt. So he's going to be going south, and the Babylonians are outside of the gate, and Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And you would think, when is it a good time to buy a house? Is it a good time to buy a house just when you're going to be carried away captive, when everything's going to be burnt to the ground? You say, that's not a good time to buy a house, unless you're in a buyer's market, whatever. But the Lord comes to Jeremiah at that moment when everything looks terrible, and he says, I want you to go buy land right now. And so he goes and he buys an entire field because the Lord says, this is a good time to buy. This is perfect. The significance for Jeremiah is what? Yes, I know that you're going to be carried away captive, and yes, there's going to be some difficult times, but you're going to come back and have your own land. This is going to be yours. The land that Jeremiah purchased cost him 17 shekels. So if the land that Jeremiah bought cost 17 shekels and David paid 50 shekels for the Temple Mount, the fact that Abraham paid 400 shekels for this piece of land tells me that Ephron really made a killing. I mean, he did really good. And the striking thing about the way that they debated back together, they're demurring, they're kind of, back and forth, and finally in the end they say, we're not going to argue over prices, and you can just have it, but it's going to cost you a couple $1,000,000 bucks, is basically what he says in the end. And so Abraham buys that land, and it becomes the first land, the only land of the children of Israel that they own. Now, a shekel, I did know that, but I don't remember it today. Someone might even have it in the Bible somewhere. Yeah, no, shekels are big, yeah. A denarius is a day's wage. And so a shekel would be like 100 times more, or 1,000 times more. Shekels are big money, actually. So I'll look that up and let you know next week. One more thing that I want to mention to you is the reason why, and this would be fine for this morning. The reason why this was the land that they purchased and that Abraham wanted to buy the land is simply this. This land becomes what one person calls a lodestone. And I need to spell it for you and then define it for you. Lodestone is spelled Lodestone. A lodestone means that which becomes magnetic or becomes a beacon or that which draws you back to a place. The lodestone of the land of Israel, the land of Palestine or Canaan, is this burial site. And so when the children of Israel are in Egypt for 420 years and they come back and they have 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and it's finally time to go back into the land. Do you know where they go first? Anybody want to guess? The text says that Joshua specifically, Joshua sent them up through the south, and the first place they came to was Hebron. And the Jewish history, the Talmud, makes the claim that it was Joshua and Caleb specifically, When he came into the land, they went to Machpelah, they went to the grave, and they spent some time praying at the grave before they went and looked at the giants and the food and everything else, and went out through the land. The point is, this cemetery was their beacon to come home. That's the true significance of the cave of Machpelah, in that this is our land. And there is my great-great-great-great-grandfather's grave, and my grandmother's grave, and others of the relatives also. This is our land. There's no other place in the world that we could live. That was the faith that Abraham was manifesting, and that becomes the purpose of this grave. It's again, like a magnet, calling the people back to their what? To their homeland, because Israel is their home. So as much as we typically view Genesis 23 as kind of an interruption in the middle of the story of Abraham, he puts down his anchor. And the anchor is, this is home, and this is where I bury my family, and we're never going to lose this land forever. So interesting. Next week we'll talk a little bit more, again, about grief and some of the things related to it. Let's pray, though. Thank you, Father, for this day and for your love, and thank you for the life and the lives of Abraham and Sarah, and even in the tender and sweet moment of the passing of Sarah, that Abraham actually ends up doing something incredibly significant, putting a tombstone in the land, claiming that this land is now my land. This is the land that God has given to me. And no matter what the sons of Heth would say, and others, that it wasn't just something given to them, and they didn't want another kind of grave. They wanted one of their own. It cost them dearly, but it was worth every penny, because of the eternal significance of that day of planting his people in the land of Israel. Lord, I pray that you would help us as we think through our lives, even to the final days, that we would live in such a way that our last day would be our best day, because the day of our death is better than the day of our birth, because now the books are closed and all that we have done is completed. Can't mess anything else up. I can't do anything else good. All I can do is rest in what God has accomplished in our lives, in my life, in our folks' life. And we ought to be ready for that day, making sure that it would be a day of honor. Thank you, Lord, for the grace you give us every day to walk with you. Remind us that we don't walk on our own, but we need you to walk with us through the valley of the shadow of death, and then ultimately into your presence. We thank you for the patriarchs and their great faith, and how that they trusted in you. Help us this day, we ask it in Jesus' glorious name. Amen.